Black Blade, a serialized adventure podcast by Andrew Israelsen. Bruckner stepped through the aperture in the stone wall that he and his companions had created, drawing his sword and raising his shield. The great cavern spread out before his feet, 30 feet below. The only means of approach to the floor below was a series of harsh switchbacks cut into the ancient stone beneath Hellespore. The cavern echoed with King Janessin's wails as the bearded devil, a tall, spindly monster with a forked beard and eyes of yellow fire, slammed him down atop the sacramental altar. The succubus shrieked with laughter as she pinned one of the monarch's wrists. Her long, cruel nails coaxing drops of scarlet blood from the royal forearm. A swarm of small, winged, demonic figures, shrunken, hideous creatures, with smeared and sneering faces, took to the air, winging towards the three adventurers. Bruckner leapt from the top switchback, rolling as he landed on a ledge 15 feet below. He nearly rolled off of that one to the floor beyond, but dug the edge of his shield against the spur of rock, halting his descent. He pulled himself to his feet in time to stab his sword through a leathery wing. The vicious, fanged creature slid screaming down his blade, his teeth snapping furiously inches from Bruckner's face. The swordsman bellowed and swung his sword hard, cleaving through the fore-wing bone and sending the wretch crashing to the distant floor. "Here!" Tadalac shouted from above, flicking a globule of shimmering black energy at Nima. It hit her in the chest, and the room contracted around her, as if the whole of the cavern had inhaled abruptly. "The spaces are woven together now, Nima. Can you see the holes?" And indeed the half-elf could, for honeycombed now through the empty extension about her were hidden paths and swift shortcuts. She stepped through one such, emerging onto the cavern floor, a mere 30 paces from the Hellions, preparing their unholy sacrament. She loaded a bolt as the succubus finished tying off one of the king's hands, and she fired it at the spindle-thin devil, striking him on the shoulder. Black blood dripped from the wound as he roared, and where it fell, the stone underfoot smoked. Bruckner took the downward path in great strides, cleaving a second imp through the waist as he ran. The two halves of the once-whole creature whirled through the air, the blood splattering in wide, lazy circles. As Bruckner made it around the last bend and began the final descent to the floor of the infernal cathedral, the tall, bearded devil appeared before him in a plume of pale red fire, a long glaive upheld to strike.
"You fool."
The Cormorantian raised his shield, but not fast enough to stop the serrated edge which caught him on the thigh, cutting through the swordsman's leather to bite into flesh. Blood began to pour from the wound. The succubus was tying down another of the king's flailing limbs. The remaining swordsman, charred into near oblivion by Tadalac's fireball, rose slowly and began to walk, still lit up here and there by tongues of flickering flame eating at his flesh. He leapt 30 feet into the air to crash down in front of Nima, bringing a fiery sword upon her with an inhuman howl. She slipped through a cleft in reality and emerged behind him, and his sword bit upon nothing. She drew her dagger and plunged it into the demon's back. The thing burst apart in an explosion of brimstone that sent Nima sprawling, coughing and retching as sulfur filled her lungs. Tadalac yelped as the bearded devil struck Bruckner, calling out, "I'm coming, Ox!" running and leaping off of the first ledge onto the patch directly below. The little fellow landed poorly, falling heavily on his side, picked himself up painfully and hobbled forward, whirling his hand and calling out in one of the heavenly tongues. A bright crackle of light appeared behind the tall, angular devil, and an angelic bear was suddenly there, with a bright white roar. The beast, woven out of light and starfire, leapt upon the fiend, slashing deep with sidereal claws and ripping a dripping haunch of flesh from his side with its mighty fangs. Her head spinning and her tongue thick with mephitic ash, Nima crawled through a gap in corporeal space, emerging next to Tadalac, who had been some 45 feet away, he still lying winded from his fall. She patted his arm and then loosed another bolt at the devil, locked in combat with Bruckner and the bear. The missile whirred towards him, but he swung his weapon with impossible speed, batting the arrow away. Bruckner stepped back as the devil whirled to deal with the bear. He tied a swift tourniquet about his upper thigh to try and stem the flood of blood. The wound was unnatural somehow, as if infected by the evil of the one who had inflicted it. The blood slowed, but did not stop. The swordsman managed to slash out at a third imp, catching it glancingly along the lower leg. It careened to the side, circling back to bear down upon Bruckner with a thin, barbed spear, but was blasted out of the sky by a beam of crystal light, cast from Tadalac's fingertip, and it crashed into a shatter of bloody quartz on the ground. The bearded devil turned and swiped at the bear, opening its stomach to reveal the starlight inside. King Janessin was putting up a fight meanwhile. He managed to connect with a thrashing foot, kicking the succubus in the stomach and sending her momentarily sprawling to the ground. She rose with such a scream that even the other devils cowered a moment. And she slashed 4 long rakes down the king's chest and belly. The star bear and the infernal man continued their dance, taking pieces off of one another with each swipe, strike, or bite. Tadalac picked up a pebble, kissed it with a whisper, and slung it toward an imp diving towards he and Nima. The little stone ballooned into a boulder as it flew, catching the imp and smashing him up into the ceiling. He snatched his healing wand in one hand and grabbed Nima around the leg. "We need to get to Bruckner," he called, and Nima carried him through the void, directly to the swordsman's side. Bruckner was growing faint. His blood was pooling at his feet. He swung at the devil before him, opening his side, and then Nima and Tadalac were beside him. Tadalac pressed the wand to Bruckner's wound, closing it. His face was white as a ghost, but he stayed on his feet, weakened but no longer actively dying.
"My thanks, Tadalac,"
Bruckner said, before raising his sword to bat at a wheeling imp, shearing off a barbed tail and a cloven hoof. "You can't go dying on Tadalac. We have devils to kill." The little gnome seemed very ferocious in the midst of the raging battle.
"We must get to the king!"
Bruckner bellowed, ducking under an arrow loosed from a minion's bow and turning to race towards the altar, where the succubus was now lashing down the king's final free limb. The spindle-legged devil put his cruel glaive through the belly of the bear, which cried out in tones of dying starlight. It gave one last mighty bite to the demon's face before disappearing in a puff of vapor. Bleeding from puncture wounds through the skull, the tall demon turned in a frenzy, throwing his weapon in a long spinning arc that caught Bruckner on the calves, bringing him painfully down onto his back. The fork-bearded devil, now weaponless, turned to Nima and roared with a mouthful of hellfire. Nima aimed her crossbow at his forehead and sent a bolt of crackling light directly between his eyes. He dropped dead to the floor with a long, gravelly growl. "Die!" Twitched, then lay still. Tadalac raised a hand and sent a ray of flame at the succubus, striking her in the back and setting her gossamer thin robes ablaze. She screamed as the fire took her and fell rolling to the ground. But she was swiftly back to her feet, and rushing to the side of the altar, angry boils showing on her pale white skin, tattered shreds of burning garments sending up smoke like incense before an ordained sacrifice. The king was sobbing, bleeding from many wounds, and begging for aid. She pulled a long, curved black dirk from a sheath strapped to her waist and began to raise it above her head, which was tilting back wildly. She began to scream, ululating in violent, frightful tones, the blade slowly rising. "Come on, Ock, she's going to kill him! Nima!" Tadalac cried. He raised a hand to cast a spell, but was tackled to the ground by a frenzied imp, and the two tumbled across the stone floor, wrestling and tearing at each other. Sparks and shreds of fire flew from Tadalac's fingers, but he could not get a spell off as the creature bit at his shoulders and face and clawed at his little form. Bruckner dashed from where he stood to run toward the succubus, who was still raising the knife above Janessin, forming terrible syllables with her forked tongue. A dark energy began to encircle the altar, and the king's screams grew yet wilder and more panicked. She brought the knife down. Bruckner slashed out, straining with the tip of his sword in a wide arc, and batted the black dagger from the she-devil's hand right before it plunged into the king's chest. She whirled and her face transformed into a landscape of hatred and rage, the fair features melting to reveal a witch visage, all the beautiful white skin sloughing off a smashed and moldering face and liquid rivulets of false flesh. Bruckner opened her stomach with a forehand slash. She screamed as the blood flowed and turned to flee. Bruckner swung after her, but his blade bit only the empty air. Nima took aim at the final imp, wrestling with Tadalac, and put a bolt in the back of its neck. The gnome pushed the devil wretch off of him and emerged, bloodied, but with only superficial damage. Meanwhile, the succubus had reached the far end of the cavern, and was climbing uncertainly up the sheer wall with bizarre, inhuman gestures. Janessin was sobbing and straining against his bonds. He shouted to Bruckner, who stood on one side of the altar, saying,
"Quick, lad, release me! Do it, boy, I command you! Get me out!
The young swordsman made haste to quickly sever the king's bonds with his dagger. The disgraced monarch dropped to the floor, covering his shame with his robes, and grasped Bruckner's arm.
Thank you, lad. You and your companions are most brave. She-devil! Why, the witch ensnared me. Go kill her. She is a danger to all of Savar.
Bruckner turned after the fleeing succubus, saw her reach a ledge some 25 feet off of the floor, her hand reaching up to grasp the outcropping side. Before her fingers could curl around the ridge of rock, however, a flash of steel glinted above, reflecting the firelight, and the hand of the succubus disappeared, her wrist suddenly a stump, spewing black-red blood. She screamed and fell to the ground, flailing, her sinuous form crunching into the rock below. Seconds later, a coruscating beam of lightning blasted into her broken body, and her scream grew until the sound began to fragment, breaking into static strains of madness. Bloody and twitching with electrical light, the succubus was moaning her last, bleeding out onto the rock floor. She began to murmur in some abyssal tongue, blood pouring out of her mouth and severed wrist. Then she died,